Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving deep today into, well, a really fascinating area, Sanskrit philology. And this isn't just about, one ancient language. It's more like a window into the structure and the history of how languages evolve.
Right, especially within that huge family tree, the Indo-European languages.
Exactly. So we're using this pretty comprehensive handbook as our guide here.
Yeah, think of it like it gives us a kind of X-ray vision, lets us see the nuts and bolts of Sanskrit.
Right.
And it reveals these crucial connections back to, well, the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European language. And it shows how those ancient features played out, not just in Sanskrit, but, across related languages too.
And our mission, really, for this deep dive is to give you a shortcut.
A shortcut, okay.
Yeah, we're going to try and pull out the most interesting, insightful bits from this academic work. The principles that show how sounds change in predictable ways, how words are built, how they form new ideas, and even, what happens when people speaking the language step outside the strict rules or borrow from their neighbors.
It's all about appreciating that incredible history, isn't it? And the hidden architecture within the language itself.
Totally. And it's all grounded in the details from this source.
So we'll look at the foundational sound laws, the morphology, how words are structured, word formation.
And then we'll touch on those linguistic deviations you mentioned. And external influences, too.
Should be interesting.
So let's start with maybe one of the most powerful tools philologists use for tracking those family connections across, millennia.
Sound laws.
Sound laws, yeah. The basic idea is pretty remarkable when you think about it. Languages split off, they diverge, but they don't just drift randomly.
No, they change following these incredibly consistent patterns, sound shifts.
And the most famous example, which our source details pretty well, is Grimm's law.
Ah, yes, Grimm's law. It's not just some abstract rule, is it? It's a set of predictable consonant correspondences.
Right. It lets us see the relationship between Proto-Indo-European and the Germanic languages.
That's where English, German, Dutch, Gothic, all those come from.
And the handbook gives credit, where it's due. It mentions Rasmus Christian Rask first noticed these patterns.
That's right, the Dane. But it was Jacob Grimm who really systematized them later.
It's just wild you can trace these shifts so precisely over such long time spans.
It really is. And a classic part of Grimm's law is how those original Indo-European voiced aspirated stops, sounds like BH, DH, G.
Nice breathy ones.
Yeah, exactly. How they consistently turned into voiced non-aspirated stops, BDG, in the Germanic languages.
Okay.
So the source gives the example of the root berry. In Old Indo-Aryan, Sanskrit, it's barami. It keeps that BH.
Right.
But in English, it becomes bear. That initial BH shifts to a B. That's Grimm's law right there, linking Sanskrit and English through a predictable change.
Okay, so that's a really fundamental one.
Yeah.
But language is messy, right? It can't all be that neat. Are there exceptions? Or other laws for more specific things?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where it gets even more interesting, I think. The handbook brings up Grassmann's law, for instance.
Grassmann's law.
Now, this one is specific to Sanskrit and Greek, two other major branches of Indo-European.
Okay.
And it describes this process called dissimilation. Basically, if a word originally had two aspirated consonants, one after the other in successive syllables.
Like two of those breathy sounds close together.
Exactly. One of them would lose its aspiration. It becomes unaspirated.
So the language sort of avoids having two heavy sounds too close. Is that the idea?
That's a good way to put it. It's like a kind of sound cleaning mechanism. Our source uses the IE root bud. Right. In Sanskrit, that becomes budhati. And in Greek, puth. See how in both cases that first aspirated sound, the BH, lost its puckiness.
Yeah, it became B or P.
Because of the DH that followed it. So it's a very specific shared change that tells us something important about the shared history, or at least parallel development, of Sanskrit and Greek after they split off.
Huh. Fascinating. And the source mentions Verner's law, too. That sounds even more intricate. Something about stress.
Yes. Verner's law is another layer. It describes how certain voiceless consonants in Germanic behave differently depending on where the accent, the stress, fell in the original Proto-Indo-European word.
Wow, okay. So the stress mattered.
It did. It showed that whether the accent came before or after the consonant could actually change how that consonant evolved later in Germanic. It refined Grimm's law and showed accent could be a driver of sound change.
It's mind-bending how regular these ancient shifts are.
It is pretty amazing.
So, okay, those laws look at the big picture changes over time. What about how sounds interact just right next to each other? within a word or, when you're speaking quickly.
Right, that's what the source calls syntagmatic phenomena, sounds influencing their immediate neighbors. And in Old Indo-Aryan, Sanskrit, the most prominent example, the one everyone knows, is Sandhi.
Sandhi, yeah, that feels absolutely central to Sanskrit.
It really is. It's basically the euphonic combination of sounds, making things sound smoother, flow better when words are spoken quickly together.
So joining sounds up.
Exactly, or even within a single word. It's all about ease of pronunciation. The Handbook explains it leads to things like vowels merging together or consonants changing to match the sound that comes next.
And it happens inside words and between words.
Yes, internal Sandhi within words and external Sandhi between words. That's very noticeable in Sanskrit, where the end of one word can change quite dramatically based on the beginning of the next word.
So it's not just like sloppy speech. It's a systematic way the language links sounds.
Absolutely systematic. The rules in Sanskrit are incredibly detailed, even though they're based on natural phonetic tendencies.
Okay. Are there other types of these neighborly influences?
Oh, yeah. Beyond Sandhi, the source points to other types. A very common one is assimilation.
Assimilation. Sounds becoming more alike.
Precisely. A sound becomes more like a neighboring sound. The Handbook gives the example tat plus kakram.
Tat, kakram. Okay.
Tat means that. When these join up, the final T in tat changes to match the C that follows it. So you get takakram.
Takakram. I see. It's easier to say tak than Satya.
Exactly. The sounds are trying to, get along better, reduce the effort.
Okay, so sounds making friends. What about the opposite?
That's dissimilation, where similar sounds become less alike, which, as we said, Grassmann's law is actually a type of.
Right, losing the aspiration to avoid having two similar sounds.
Yeah.
Okay, what about sounds just moving around in a word? Did that happen?
It does. That's called metathesis. Sounds or syllables swap places.
Seriously?
Yep. The source mentions the Vedic word vamri. In classical Old Indo-Aryan, it became Valmika.
So the R and the R just switched.
They switched positions. It's a surprising kind of rearrangement that happens sometimes. Not super common, but it occurs.
Okay, so sounds change, sounds become similar, sounds become different, sounds swap places. What about adding or removing sounds?
Yes, those happen too. Processes like anaptixis. Anaptixis, that's when a vowel gets inserted between consonants, usually to break up a cluster that's hard to pronounce.
Ah, okay, like sticking a vowel in to make it easier.
Exactly.
Right.
Or prosthesis, which is adding a sound, usually a vowel, at the beginning of a word. The Handbook mentions this happen in Greek sometimes. Words that started with certain consonant clusters in PIE got a vowel tacked onto the front in Greek.
It seems like all these changes, whether over centuries or just in quick speech, are driven by a mix of, historical accident maybe, but also just making things easier to say.
Very often, yes. Ease of articulation is a huge factor. And the source also details changes based on where in the mouth sounds are made.
Like front or back of the mouth.
Right. Things like palatalization, where sounds made further back, like K or G, shift forward towards the hard palate. We mentioned Kollitz's law earlier in relation to this. Or cerebralization. This is a really specific change in Indo-Aryan languages. Dental sounds, like T or D, made with the tongue tip at the teeth, can become cerebral sounds, made with the tongue curled back towards the roof of the mouth, usually under the influence of a nearby R or sound.
That's very specific.
It is. Shows how sounds influence each other based on articulation points. There's also dentalization, labialization, making sounds more dental or lip-rounded, and spirantization, where a stop consonant like P or T becomes a fricative, a spirant, like F or the. And rhoticism.
Rhoticism.
That's typically when an S sound changes into an R sound. Happened a lot in Latin, for example.
Wow, okay. It really makes you listen to words differently, doesn't it? Thinking about the journey their sounds have taken.
Definitely.
All right, that's a lot about sounds. Let's shift gears a bit. How are the words themselves structured? Morphology. Let's start with nouns.
Right. Morphology, the building blocks of words. The Handbook breaks nouns down into these key categories inherited from Proto-Indo-European: number, gender, and case.
Okay. Number first.
So for number, PIE had singular, obviously plural, and dual.
Dual.
Yeah, a specific form for exactly two of something. And what's remarkable, as the source highlights, is that Old Indo-Aryan Sanskrit preserved the dual.
Whereas lots of other languages lost it.
Exactly. Many other IE languages drop the dual, merging it into the plural usually. So Sanskrit keeping it is seen as a more conservative feature. It held on to that older distinction.
Okay. And gender.
Same story, really.
Yeah.
PIE had 3 grammatical genders: masculine, feminine, and neuter. And Old Indo-Aryan kept all 3.
Like German still does?
Right. And the Handbook makes the crucial point that grammatical gender isn't always natural gender. It's a grammatical category.
Oh, yeah. You mentioned the example Dara.
Exactly. Dara means wife in Sanskrit, but the word itself is grammatically masculine.
That's brilliant. So you can't just guess the grammar from the meaning.
Definitely not. And then there are cases.
Cases. This is where it gets complicated for English speakers.
Well, cases basically tell you the noun's job in the sentence. Is it the subject doing the action, the direct object receiving it, the instrument used, the location?
Right.
Proto-Indo-European is reconstructed as having had 8 cases: nominative, accusative, instrumental, dative, ablative, genitive, locative, and vocative.
8. Wow.
And Old Indo-Aryan Sanskrit preserved all 8 of them.
Every single one. That's incredible. I mean, English basically has, what, possessive nouns?
Mm-hmm.
And that's about it for case endings on nouns.
Pretty much, yeah. Pronouns retain a bit more, but the source really contrasts Sanskrit's full system with languages like Greek or Latin. They saw more syncretism.
Syncretism, meaning?
Meaning different case functions started sharing the same ending. They merged. Like maybe the dative and ablative ended up looking the same in some forms.
Okay. But Sanskrit kept them all distinct.
Largely, yes. Which means a lot of grammatical information is packed right into the noun's ending. You can tell its function just by looking at the form. The tables in the source showing wolf or horse across languages really drive this home. You see the full grid in Sanskrit.
Okay. And adjectives just follow the nouns.
Pretty much. They decline like nouns, agreeing in number, gender, and case with the noun they modify.
Makes sense.
And they have ways to show comparison, like comparative bigger and superlative biggest, using specific suffixes, similar in concept to English and est, but obviously different forms.
Got it. What about numbers? Are they weird?
They have their own quirks, yeah. The Handbook explains that in PIE, numbers 1 through 4 were fully inflected, like adjectives. They agreed in case, gender, number. Sanskrit keeps that complexity for 1 to 4. 1 is singular, obviously. 2 to 4 function like duals or plurals and inflect fully. But then numbers 5 through 19 have more limited inflection, and 20 and up decline more regularly, like nouns.
Huh. So even counting words have this layered history.
Absolutely. Shows how grammar evolves differently even within the same word class.
Okay, so we've covered the sort of static parts of the sentence, the nouns and adjectives. Now for the action. Verbs.
Verbs, yes. Often seen as the most complex part of Sanskrit grammar.
That's the reputation anyway.
But the source clarifies it largely inherited its structure from Proto-Indo-European. You're dealing with familiar concepts, really. Roots, person, number, voice, mood, tense, and different stem systems to build all the forms.
The source mentioned Patini cataloged nearly 2,000 verbal roots.
Something like that, yeah. It's a very rich system for expressing action and states.
Okay, so what are the key categories for verbs?
Well, like nouns, they have number, singular, dual, and plural. And person first, second, and third. I go, you two go, they go.
Right. Dual again?
Dual again. They also have voice, primarily active voice, where the subject does the action.
I see the tree.
Exactly. And middle voice. This one's a bit trickier, often indicates the action affects the subject or is done for the subject's own benefit. Sometimes reflexive. The passive voice, where the subject receives the action, the tree is seen by me, is actually, according to the source, a later development in Sanskrit itself, not directly inherited in the same way as active and middle.
Oh, that's interesting. So passive isn't as ancient.
Apparently not in its fully formed Sanskrit state. Then you have moods.
Moods.
Yeah.
Like happy, sad.
No, grammatical moods. They tell you about the speaker's attitude towards the action. Is it a plain statement of fact? That's the indicative mood.
Right.
Is it a possibility, a wish, a potential action? That's often the subjunctive or optative moods. Is it a command? That's the imperative.
Got it. Like go versus you might go.
Exactly. And tenses, of course. Placing the action in time. Present, past, future. The Handbook notes that OIA developed some new tense forms, like a pluperfect, compared to what's reconstructed for basic PIE.
And these stem systems it mentions. Present stem, aorist stem, perfect stem. What are those exactly?
They're basically different ways of forming the base of the verb before you add the personal endings. The root itself often combines with various suffixes or undergoes internal changes, like a vowel gradation ablaut, to form these different stems.
Okay.
So you have a present stem for present actions, an aorist stem often for simple past actions, a perfect stem for completed actions with present relevance, a future stem, and then you stick the endings for person, number, and voice onto the appropriate stem.
It sounds very architectural, like building with Lego blocks.
That's a good analogy. It's a highly organized, though complex system.
And verbs can also become things that aren't quite full verbs, like infinitives.
Exactly. Non-finite forms. The source mentions infinitives. In Sanskrit, they often function like verbal nouns, essentially representing the action itself, treated as specific case forms of that action noun. Like the nadam ending is often seen as an accusative infinitive.
Okay. And participles.
Participles are like verbal adjectives. They come from a verb root, carry a verbal meaning like tense and voice, but they describe a noun, like the running man. Running is a participle.
Right.
And they decline like adjectives, agreeing with the noun. Sanskrit has participles for various tenses and voices present, future, perfect, past, passive.
And gerunds.
Gerunds are another type of verbal noun, often indeclinable in Sanskrit, typically expressing an action done before the main verb action, like having eaten, I left. Having eaten could be expressed by a gerund.
Okay, that covers the core word types and their structures.
Yeah.
What about how new words are formed, beyond just adding endings for grammar?
Good question. The Handbook touches on this too. Word formation. It briefly mentions indeclinables first.
Words that don't change form.
Right. Adverbs, prepositions, conjunctions, interjections. Often, adverbs actually originated from old case forms of nouns or pronouns that got frozen in time. Prepositions were often used adverbially too, or compounded directly with verbs.
Okay. But the big thing seems to be compounds, Samāsa.
Yes, Samāsa is hugely important in Old Indo-Aryan morphology. It's where you join two or more independent words, which could function separately on sentence, into a single, new, compound word.
Why do that?
The Handbook emphasizes its purpose, partly for brevity, sure, making things shorter, but also for unity. And crucially, it often adds an additional sense. The compound means something slightly more specific or different than just the sum of its parts.
Can you give that Rajaputta example again?
Sure, Raja means king, Pura means man, so literally king's man. But the compound Rajaputta doesn't just mean any man belonging to the king. It often specifically refers to like a royal servant, an official, a courtier.
So it creates a more specific concept.
Exactly. It's a way of building vocabulary and expressing nuances very efficiently. Paini famously classified these compounds into different types based on their internal structure and meaning, like tatpura, bovri, bhavanva.
That's a really powerful mechanism. What about other ways words change or influence each other? Analogy.
Analogy is a huge force in language change, though maybe less about forming new words and more about reshaping existing ones. It's where one word form or pattern influences another, usually making things more regular or consistent.
Like if one type of noun declension starts to copy another more common one.
Exactly. Or irregular verbs becoming regular. The language system kind of tidies itself up by making related forms behave more alike, based on analogy with other patterns.
And folk etymology. That sounds fun.
It is. This is when people, popularly try to explain where a word comes from by linking it to other words that sound similar, even if that link is completely wrong historically.
Like the example from the source, sparrowgrass.
That's the classic one for English. People heard the unfamiliar word asparagus, and their brains reanalyzed it as sparrow plus grass. Maybe they saw sparrows near it, or it looked grassy. It made a kind of sense, even though it's linguistically incorrect.
Right. The brain trying to make sense of the unfamiliar by relating it to the familiar, even if it creates a fantasy origin.
Exactly. The source also briefly mentions meta-analysis.
Meta-analysis.
That's when the boundary between words gets misunderstood or shifted over time, like an apron becoming an apron. The N sound moved from the noun to the article.
Okay, I see.
So these processes show how language isn't static, how user understanding and analogy shape its evolution too.
Okay, one last area the Handbook touches on. What happens when language use deviates?
Yeah.
Or when languages meet?
Right. Linguistic deviations and external influences. It brings up the concept of solecism.
Solecism. Sounds serious.
It basically means speaking or writing incorrectly. ungrammatically. The term itself comes from Greek, apparently from Soloi, a place whose dialect was considered, well, substandard by Athenians.
Okay, so in Sanskrit it means?
In the Sanskrit context, it often refers to usages that don't strictly follow the rules laid down by the great grammarian Pakini, using a form or construction he didn't describe.
But the source points out this isn't just about people making mistakes, is it?
Not entirely, because Patini described the Sanskrit of his time and place, a particular standard, but language changes naturally over time and varies geographically and socially.
So later writers might use forms that weren't in Patini's grammar.
Exactly. And the Indian grammatical tradition was interesting. Later commentators and grammarians often acknowledged these un-Patinian usages, especially if they were found in the works of respected poets or playwrights. Sometimes they'd accept them, sometimes try to find ways to justify them within the system.
So it shows that grammar follows language, not the other way around.
In a sense, yes. Descriptive grammar records the facts of language as people use it and acknowledges that those facts can evolve. It highlights that language is dynamic, not frozen by the rules.
And India itself is such a mix of languages. Did other non-Indo-European languages influence Sanskrit?
Oh, absolutely. India has ancient language families besides Indo-European Dravidian in the south, Austroasiatic like Mancha, Sino-Tibetan in the northeast. Sanskrit, as an Indo-Aryan language arriving later, was inevitably in contact with these languages for thousands of years. Pinpointing the exact influence is really hard, especially grammatically.
But it happened.
Unquestionably. The Handbook notes that influence is found especially in vocabulary. Borrowing words is usually the easiest type of influence to spot. It mentions some suggested examples, like possible loanwords from Babylonian or the Austroasiatic Mandalay languages. Grammar is harder to trace, but likely happened too.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, we've seen how philology, through this handbook's lens on Sanskrit, uses tools like sound laws to trace these really deep historical connections.
Right, and how it dissects the intricate structure of words, the morphology of nouns, verbs, everything.
And how new words are built through compounding, and how language adapts through things like analogy, and even deals with mistakes or outside influences.
It really paints a picture of Sanskrit not just as some monolithic ancient thing, but as a dynamic system. One that preserved many ancient features from Proto-Indo-European, but also underwent its own systematic changes and innovations.
Yeah, philology gives us the keys to unlock that history.
Exactly.
And understanding these principles, it's not just about Sanskrit, is it? It gives you a framework, a way of thinking about any language, how it grows, how it changes, how different branches of the same family might diverge, but still show traces of their shared past.
Absolutely. It reveals the underlying logic, the patterns that shape the sounds and structures we use every single day, often completely unconsciously. Things like ablaut or Sandhi-like processes, they echo everywhere.
So here's maybe a final thought for you, listening to this deep dive. Next time you hear a word, maybe even a very common word in your own language, just take a second. Consider that its sounds, its structure, they aren't just random. They're likely the result of thousands of years of these subtle, systematic shifts and interactions, governed by principles very much like the ones we've just scratched the surface of in ancient Sanskrit. It's history encoded in sound.
Well put. Thanks for joining us on this exploration into Sanskrit philology.
Yeah, thanks for listening. Keep an ear out for those patterns.